There are several ways to measure quality of life. One way is to survey people and ask them how happy are they? And they have been doing that around the world recently. But another way is to look at the opportunities that people have to satisfy their basic needs and to achieve a high quality of life. And the psychological research and ecological research shows that there are 4 types of capital that are necessary to provide sustainable human well-being. Not only our built capital infrastructure, our conventional consumption of goods and services, but also our human capital, our individual well-being, our health, our education and information, but also our social capital, all of the interactions between people, our institutions, our networks, etc. And our natural capital is extremely important, our ecological life support system. So to achieve a high quality of life that's sustainable, we need all 4 of those types of capital in the appropriate balance. And we've been paying too little attention to our natural capital and our social capital assets. The GDP is not a good measure of economic well-being. It was never designed as a measure of economic well-being. It only measures marketed income. And I think that is becoming much more recognized. In the decades right after World War II, it was correlated with increasing well-being. Increasing GDP and increasing well-being were correlated because that was the limiting factor. But that's no longer the case. And I think that's increasingly recognized, that GDP measures costs as well as benefits, and it's not a good measure of well-being. Alternatives exist. I think there's growing consensus that something different is necessary. For example, one alternative is called the Genuine Progress Indicator, and it takes into account the distribution of income, which is not accounted for in GDP. It takes into account some things that are left out that should be included, like the value of volunteer work and household labor, and it subtracts a bunch of things that shouldn't be counted as positives. The cost of crime, for example, the cost of cleaning up an oil spill, the cost of the loss of natural capital assets and ecosystem services. All of those things are subtracted as they should be. When you apply that kind of measure, the Genuine Progress Indicator, you find that, for example, in the United States, the GPI was correlated with GDP up until around 1975, and then they started to diverge, and GDP continued to increase while GPI leveled off. So we've been in a quality of life recession in the United States ever since 1975. And people do realize that because they recognize that their quality of life has not really been improving. They've been working harder, not getting as far, spending too much of their time working to buy things as opposed to doing things that actually contribute more to their quality of life, but without having to purchase them. So I'm not saying that GPI is the perfect measure, and I think this is an important research area to better understand what does contribute to quality of life for people, and then to try to maximize that rather than continuing to assume that more consumption is going to lead to a better quality of life. I think alternative indicators need to look at a broad range of things, as they need to look at these 4 types of capital that I mentioned, the natural, social, built, and human capital. So they need to cover all 4 of those types of components of quality of life. And I think they need to also look at the interaction between people's subjective well-being, how they feel about their life, and the more objective components of the environment, of the social and natural environment that allow them the opportunities to meet their needs and to feel a sense of subjective well-being. So there's no alternative, I think, that has achieved consensus, but I think that's the process that we're in right now, is sort of building that consensus among the various alternatives that are out there and the various perspectives on quality of life. So it's an important, emerging research area, but I think the important thing is to recognize that quality of life is a much more complex thing than simply, the more we consume, the better off we are. I think people do recognize that conventional income and consumption is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. And that too narrow a focus on materialist consumption actually leads to a lowering of people's quality of life. So there is significant psychological research around this issue that's been coming out. So I think people do recognize that, but I think our advertising industry and our sort of consumer culture encourages people to confuse consumption with well-being. That's part of the whole issue or the goal of advertising, is to convince people that consuming something will make them happier. That works sometimes in some places and up to a point, but the point is that beyond a certain point, the costs of that consumption begin to outweigh the benefits. And that's what we're seeing at the national and the global scale. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to recognize that fact, and then to begin to build the right incentives into the system so people can also act on that information.